The German soldier's hands trembled as his rifle clattered to the wet cobblestones. 23-year-old Joe Medicine Crow stood close enough to see tears streaming down the enemy's face, close enough to hear him gasp a single word that transcended all the languages of war. Mama. In that frozen heartbeat, with death balanced on the edge of a trigger pull, Joe faced an impossible choice. Every instinct of his army training screamed one thing. Every whispered teaching of his Crow grandfather, every sacred story told beside winter fires on the Montana reservation demanded something else entirely. What Joe did next would make him the last man in history to achieve an honor no American warrior had claimed in over 60 years, an achievement that would one day bring him face to face with a president in the White House, wearing eagle feathers and the weight of his ancestors' legacy. But to understand that moment in the alley, you need to know how a scholar with a master's degree became a legendary warrior, and how ancient Plains Indian traditions collided with the most modern, mechanized war in human history. October 1913, Lodge Grass, Montana. The world that welcomed baby Joseph Medicine Crow was already vanishing like campfire-soaking wind. His grandfather, the original Medicine Crow, had counted coup against Sioux warriors in battles that were now fading into legend. The old man's hands bore scars from arrows and knives. His chest carried marks of the Sundance. His eyes had seen buffalo herds that blackened the prairie for miles. But by the time little Joe drew his first breath, the buffalo were gone, the warrior societies had disbanded, and the Crow people were confined to a reservation, their ancient way of life compressed into government-approved boundaries and Indian agency regulations. Joe's earliest memories were of his grandfather's weathered hands, strong despite their age, holding him close while the old warrior spoke in the Crow language, his voice carrying the rhythm of stories told for generations. Listen carefully, grandson. I will tell you what makes a man a war chief among our people. The boy listened with the absolute attention that only children can give when they sense something sacred is being shared. You must lead warriors into battle and bring them home safely. You must touch an enemy in combat, proving your bravery by getting close enough to kill, but choosing to take his power instead. You must capture an enemy's weapon with your own hands, and you must steal an enemy's horse, the greatest prize a warrior could claim. The old man's eyes grew distant, seeing battlefields from half a century past. I did these things, Joe. My father did these things, his father before him. But you, grandson, you will never do them. That world is gone. Joe absorbed every word, not knowing that his grandfather was both right and catastrophically wrong. The old warrior world was indeed gone. But another kind of war was coming, one that would give Joe Medicine Crow the chance to achieve what seemed impossible. Young Joe grew up navigating between two worlds that seemed determined to destroy each other. At reservation schools, teachers punished children for speaking Crow, trying to kill the Indian, save the man through forced assimilation. But at home, the elders kept the culture alive in whispered conversations, in ceremonies performed away from government eyes, in stories that carried the weight of 1,000 years. Joe didn't just survive this cultural warfare, he excelled in both worlds. He devoured books in English while memorizing Crow legends. He earned top grades while learning to track deer through forests. He was brilliant, curious, hungry for knowledge from any source. In 1938, Joe Medicine Crow walked across a stage at the University of Southern California and received his master's degree in anthropology, the first Crow tribal member to achieve that level of education. He wasn't studying some abstract academic subject. He was documenting his own people's culture, preserving in scholarly writing what the elders still carried in memory. His doctoral dissertation focused on how horses had transformed Plains Indian culture, analyzing how his ancestors had taken an animal, introduced by Spanish conquistadors, and made it central to their entire way of life. Within just a few generations, it was brilliant work, drawing praise from his professors. Joe's future seemed clear. He would become der Medicine Crow, a respected anthropologist, a bridge between academic understanding and living native culture. Then December 7th, 1941, burned those plans to ash. Joe was sitting in a library when someone burst in shouting about Pearl Harbor, about Japanese planes, about America at war. At 28, he was older than the boys lining up at recruitment offices, old enough to seek an exemption. Graduate students studying anthropology were sometimes considered more valuable documenting native cultures than carrying rifles. But Joe didn't hesitate for even a moment. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory like a drum beat. The Crow had always been warriors. When the United States cavalry had needed scouts to fight their traditional Sioux enemies, Crow men had served with honor. When the First World War had exploded across Europe, Crow volunteers had enlisted in numbers far exceeding their tiny population percentage. This was the Crow way. When your people faced danger, you stepped forward, and Joe understood something his professors might not have grasped. America was his people now, too. He was Crow and American, both identities woven together inseparably. An attack on America was an attack on the Crow Nation. In 1943, he enlisted in the United States Army. Basic training was an interesting experience for a 30-year-old with a master's degree. Joe could discuss Durkheim's theories of social structures, but he also had to learn how to field strip an M1 Garand rifle in the dark. He could cite anthropological studies on warfare, but he also had to survive bayonet drills and forced marches. His drill sergeant, a tobacco-chewing veteran of the First World War named O'Brien, initially looked at Joe with skepticism. Another college boy who'd probably wash out after a week of real Army life. But O'Brien's opinion changed after a night navigation exercise. While other recruits got hopelessly lost in unfamiliar woods, Joe led his squad directly to the objective, using nothing but the stars, the slope of the land, and instincts he'd learned tracking game on the reservation. O'Brien pulled him aside afterward. "Medicine Crow, where the hell did you learn to move like that?" Joe smiled. "My grandfather taught me, Sergeant. The Crow have been navigating by stars since before maps existed." O'Brien nodded slowly. "The Army's assigning you to the 103rd Infantry Division as a scout. They need men who can do what you just did." Before shipping out to Europe, Joe made one final trip home to Montana. His grandfather was 89 years old now, his warrior body finally showing its age. But when the old man saw Joe in his Army uniform, his back straightened, his eyes cleared, and for a moment he looked like the fierce young warrior who'd charged into battle 7 decades earlier. They sat together outside the small house watching the sun set over the same land where Crow warriors had ridden for centuries. The old man spoke in Crow, the words carrying weight that English could never match. "You're going to fight the Germans. I've heard about them on the radio, Hitler and his Nazis. They sound like the worst kind of enemies, the kind who believe other people are less than human," Joe nodded. "That's what they believe, grandfather. They think anyone not like them should be exterminated, like what was done to our people." The old man gripped Joe's arm with surprising strength. "Then you remember the 4 coups. You're Crow. You're going to war. The enemy is different. The weapons are different, but the warrior's path hasn't changed. Lead your men with wisdom. Show bravery, but also show mercy. Take what you need from your enemies, but don't lose yourself. Come home with honor, grandson. Come home and tell me your war stories." Joe promised, not knowing that in the chaos of Nazi Germany's collapse, he would achieve all 4 coups and become the last Plains Indian war chief in history. September 1944. The 103rd Infantry Division, nicknamed the Cactus Division, landed in France 3 months after D-Day. The beaches were secure, but France was still bleeding. Every village, every field, every forest was a potential battlefield. Joe's war began with the baptism of artillery fire, the screaming whistle of incoming shells, the earth exploding in geysers of mud and shrapnel. His first week in combat, he watched a kid from Kansas named Tommy Brennan, 18 years old with his girlfriend's letters in his pocket, get cut in half by machine gun fire. Joe had studied warfare from an academic perspective, analyzing tactics and strategies in scholarly papers. This was different. This was the smell of blood and cordite, the sounds of men screaming for medics, for mothers, for God. This was death in its rawest form. But Joe also discovered something unexpected. The skills his grandfather and the Crow elders had taught him, the tracking abilities, the woodland movement, the patient observation that white society had dismissed as primitive, these skills were invaluable in modern combat. The division pushed east through France, engaging German forces in brutal close-quarters fighting. When his company needed intelligence on enemy positions, Captain Robert Harrison, a tough combat veteran from Philadelphia, would turn to Joe. "Medicine Crow, we need to know what's ahead. Take a look." Joe would slip into woods that terrified other soldiers, forests that could hide a regiment of Germans, and he'd return with detailed reports. German machine gun nest at grid coordinate 473. 3 soldiers, positioned to cover the road approach. Mortar team 500 yards northeast, probably 4 men. They've been firing every 15 minutes since dawn. Patrol of 8 men moving through Sector 5. They passed 30 minutes ago heading west. His squad mates started calling him Ghost. Sergeant Frank DeMarco, a wiry Italian-American from Brooklyn who'd survived North Africa and Sicily, watched Joe disappear into dense underbrush and emerge an hour later without a sound. "How do you do that, Joe? You move like you're made of smoke." Joe cleaned his rifle as he responded. "My people have been scouting enemy positions for 1,000 years, Frank. Germans aren't that different from Sioux or Cheyenne. They leave signs. Broken branches, disturbed soil, places where they've urinated or discarded food. The land tells stories if you know how to read them." Frank shook his head in amazement. "They should have recruited more Indians. You're worth 10 regular scouts." By November 1944, the 103rd had crossed into Germany itself. The enemy was defending their homeland now, fighting with desperate ferocity. The combat intensified. Joe saw friends killed, good men who'd survived months of fighting, cut down in moments of chaos. Private Eddie Morrison from Texas, who taught Joe how to play poker on the transport ship. Corporal James Wu, a Chinese-American who'd faced discrimination his whole life, but served with absolute courage. Lieutenant Stephen Kowalski, a young officer who'd treated Joe with respect when others had questioned whether an Indian could be a real soldier. Each death carved something out of Joe's heart, but each death also hardened his resolve. He would survive. He would honor these men by completing the mission. And somewhere in his soul, he began to understand that he was living his grandfather's stories, just in a different time and place. The first coup happened in mid-December, during the early days of what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's desperate counteroffensive. Joe's company was pinned down by German machine gun fire in a frozen forest where the temperature had dropped below zero. They'd been in position for 6 hours, unable to advance, unable to retreat, slowly running out of ammunition. Captain Harrison's face was grim as he assessed their situation. The supply line was 2 miles back through territory the Germans had infiltrated. If they didn't get ammunition soon, they'd be overrun. Harrison looked at his diminishing options, then turned to Joe. "Medicine Crow, I need you to take a squad back to the supply depot and bring forward ammunition. It's a suicide run through enemy territory, but if we don't get resupply, we're all dead anyway." "Can you do it?" Joe studied the terrain, the positions, the patterns of German movement. 2 miles of hostile forest, machine gun nests, roving patrols, possibly minefields. Every instinct screamed that this was impossible. But he thought of his grandfather leading war parties against the Sioux, riding into situations that seemed hopeless, but coming home victorious through skill and courage. He nodded. "Give me 6 men, Captain. We'll bring your ammunition." Harrison assigned him 6 soldiers, all combat veterans. Sergeant DeMarco, who'd fought through Sicily and never panicked. Private Bobby Watson from Mississippi, deadly accurate with an M1 rifle. Private Jose Hernandez from New Mexico, another soldier who'd faced discrimination but proved his worth in blood. Private Michael O'Reilly from Boston, tough as nails and smart. Private David Chen, Wu's best friend, who'd volunteered for the mission to honor his fallen comrade. And Private Raymond Hawk, a Cherokee from Oklahoma who'd bonded with Joe over their shared native heritage. As Joe prepared them for the mission, explaining the route and the danger points, these hardened combat soldiers recognized something beyond military rank. This wasn't just a sergeant giving orders. This was someone who understood the land at a level they didn't, who saw things they missed, who moved with confidence, born from knowledge that went deeper than Army training. They moved out at dusk, that dangerous transition time when light plays tricks and shadows deepen. Joe led them through terrain that seemed impassable. Narrow ravines filled with ice and snow, dense thickets of frozen brambles, paths that weren't on any map, but that Joe could sense through the shape of the land. Behind him, DeMarco whispered to Watson, "He's navigating by feel. I don't know how, but he knows exactly where we are." They heard German patrols twice, the sound of boots crunching through snow, harsh voices speaking in German. Both times, Joe's hand signal froze them in absolute stillness. German soldiers passed within yards, so close they could smell cigarette smoke, hear conversations about girlfriends back home, and when this damned war would end. When the danger passed, Joe would signal them forward, always moving, always navigating toward the objective. They reached the supply depot at full dark, loaded up with as much ammunition as they could carry, transforming themselves into pack mules burdened with bandoliers and boxes. The return journey was more dangerous. Now they were slower, heavier, and German patrols had increased after dark. Joe led them on a different route, anticipating where the enemy would expect an ammunition run and avoiding those kill zones. At one point, the only path forward crossed what Joe recognized as a minefield. The dirt was disturbed in patterns that spoke of buried death. In the darkness, the other men couldn't see what Joe saw, but they'd learned to trust him absolutely. Joe marked a safe path using small stones, leading them step by careful step through the minefield. Each man followed exactly in Joe's footsteps, knowing that one deviation meant death. O'Reilly, bringing up the rear, whispered a Hail Mary with each step. They emerged from the minefield, and Raymond Hawk exhaled slowly. Joe, my ancestors and yours just walked with us through there. I could feel them. They reached the company position just before dawn. The ammunition resupply allowed Captain Harrison to break out of the German encirclement that morning. 7 men had accomplished what seemed impossible, and not one was lost. Harrison put Joe in for the Bronze Star. But for Joe, something else mattered more than any medal. He'd led a war party into danger through enemy territory and brought every man home safely. The first coup was achieved, exactly as his grandfather had described it. January 1945 brought weeks of brutal winter combat. Germany was collapsing, but collapsing things are often most dangerous. Cornered animals fight with everything they have left. Joe saw more friends die. The nights were filled with artillery, the days with close quarters fighting. He wrote letters home to the reservation, trying to explain what he was seeing, trying to stay connected to who he was beneath the mud and blood and horror. His grandfather wrote back in shaky handwriting, "Remember, you are Crow. Whatever happens in war, don't lose that." Joe kept that letter in his breast pocket, next to his heart, a talisman against forgetting himself. The second and third coups happened on a morning in late January in a French village near the German border that had been fought over so many times no one could remember which side currently held it. The buildings were shattered, walls pockmarked with bullet holes, roofs collapsed. Death lived in every shadow. Joe was on patrol with DeMarco and Watson, checking buildings for German holdouts. They'd learned the hard way that leaving buildings uncleared meant machine gun fire from behind as you advanced. Joe entered a narrow alley between 2 stone buildings, his M1 rifle at the ready, his senses screaming that something was wrong. He was halfway through when a German soldier stepped out from a doorway. Time crystallized into that strange slow-motion clarity that comes in moments of mortal danger. The German was young, maybe 19. His uniform was filthy, torn at the shoulder. His hands shook as he raised his rifle. His eyes showed absolute terror and exhaustion. Joe could have shot him, should have shot him according to every military doctrine, every survival instinct. The German was an enemy combatant with a weapon, neutralized the threat. But in that eternal second, Joe heard his grandfather's voice with absolute clarity. To touch an enemy without killing him, to take his weapon, these are the highest forms of bravery. They prove you could have killed but chose not to. They prove you can face death and respond with something other than more death. Something deep in Joe's chest, something older than his army training, older than this war, old as the plains his ancestors had ridden, surged upward. A Crow war cry erupted from his throat, a sound he'd never made before but somehow knew in his bones, a sound that carried the fury and spirit of 1,000 years of Crow warriors. The German soldier's eyes went wide with shock. Joe charged forward, closing the distance in 3 explosive strides. He swung his rifle butt not at the man, but at the man's weapon. The German's rifle flew from his shaking hands, clattering against the alley wall. Before the German could react, before conscious thought could intervene, Joe touched him, not with his weapon, but with his hand, palm flat against the German soldier's chest, directly over his heart, the traditional way of counting coups. Touching the enemy, proving bravery, taking his power without taking his life. For a frozen moment, they stood there, 2 young men from opposite sides of the world, connected by touch in an alley in war-torn France. The German stumbled backward against the stone wall, his face crumpling. Tears flooded his eyes, cutting tracks through the dirt on his cheeks. His lips trembled as he whispered one word that transcended all languages, ideologies, or the propaganda and hatred that had brought them to this moment. Mama. He wasn't a Nazi in that moment, not an enemy soldier, not a threat, just a terrified kid who wanted his mother, who wanted to go home, who wanted this nightmare to end. Joe felt something shift in his chest, some hard place softening. The coups were achieved. The German was unarmed, broken. Joe kicked the rifle further away, then did something that would haunt and inspire him for the rest of his life. He pointed down the alley, away from American lines, toward where German forces had retreated. The German didn't move at first, couldn't process what was happening. Was this a trick? A trap? Joe made the gesture more emphatic, nodding. Go. Run. Live. The German soldier's face showed disbelief, then desperate hope. He scooped up his rifle as he passed it, then ran, his boots echoing on cobblestones, disappearing around the corner. DeMarco and Watson found Joe 30 seconds later, his rifle lowered, his face showing emotions they'd never seen before. Joe, you okay? We heard a war cry that sounded like it came from another century. Joe nodded slowly. There was a German soldier. He's gone now. They didn't ask questions. Combat was full of moments that didn't make it into after-action reports, moments where humanity broke through the machinery of war. But Joe knew exactly what had happened. He'd counted coup exactly as his grandfather had described. He'd touched an enemy in combat, taken the enemy's weapon, even if only for a moment. 2nd and 3rd coups achieved. The 4th coup seemed impossible in an age of tanks and trucks, of mechanized warfare where horses were relics. But Germany in its final agony was a place where timelines collapsed, where the modern military machine broke down and revealed the older world beneath. The German army, despite its reputation for mechanization, still relied heavily on horses. Hundreds of thousands pulled artillery, supply wagons, equipment. As Allied bombing destroyed fuel supplies and German infrastructure crumbled, horses became even more critical. It was April 1945. The war was clearly ending. Anyone with eyes could see Germany was finished. But dying empires are dangerous, thrashing in their death throes. Pockets of fanatical resistance remained, SS units that would rather die than surrender. Wehrmacht soldiers who feared what peace would bring. Joe's unit was moving through German countryside that looked almost peaceful in spring sunshine, clearing scattered enemy positions. They approached a large farm that intelligence suggested was being used as a German supply depot and possible headquarters for retreating forces. The unit set up positions around the farm, preparing to assault at dawn. Joe volunteered for night reconnaissance to gather close intelligence on the farm's defenses and estimate how many Germans they'd face. Captain Harrison, who by now trusted Joe's judgment completely, nodded approval. "Be careful, Joe. You've survived this long. I want you making it home." As darkness fell, Joe moved through shadows with skills honed over months of combat and centuries of Crow tradition. He approached the farm buildings, his senses absorbing everything. 2 sentries walking perimeter, but they were tired, inattentive. The war was clearly lost. Their movements showed they were just going through motions. Then Joe heard something that stopped him cold. Horses. He crept closer, using darkness and the bulk of a barn for cover. Behind the main building was a large corral containing at least 50 horses. German cavalry mounts and draft horses, probably gathered here for redistribution to units that still needed them, or perhaps held as transportation for German officers planning to flee into Austria as the Allied noose tightened. Joe watched for over an hour, timing the guards' patterns, studying the layout, his mind working through possibilities. An idea formed, crazy and dangerous and absolutely perfect. This was his chance. The 4th coup, the one that had seemed impossible in modern war, stealing enemy horses. He thought of his grandfather's stories, of Crow warriors raiding Sioux camps to capture horse herds, of the greatest glory a warrior could achieve. Here in Germany 70 years later, the opportunity had materialized like a vision. He waited until the guards were at their most exhausted, that dead hour before dawn, when even the most alert sentry fights to stay awake. Joe slipped past the perimeter with movements so controlled and quiet that not even the horses initially reacted. He climbed the corral fence and dropped inside with absolute silence. The horses stirred, sensing a human presence, but Joe had grown up around horses on the Crow reservation. He knew how to approach them, how to whisper soothing sounds, how to project calm confidence. He moved among them like he belonged there, selecting a strong cavalry horse with good conformation. Using rope he found in the corral, he fashioned a makeshift war bridle in the Crow style his grandfather had taught him. Then, as the first gray light of dawn touched the eastern horizon, Joe Medicine Crow did something that no warrior had done since the 1880s, something his grandfather had never dreamed possible. He mounted the German horse in one fluid motion, filled his lungs with cold morning air, and released a full-throated Crow war cry that shattered the dawn silence like thunder. The sound echoed off the farm buildings, ancient and fierce and absolutely unexpected in this time and place. Before the shocked German guards could react, Joe was driving the entire herd of 50 horses toward the corral gate, kicking it open, stampeding them toward American lines. He guided the herd with whistles and calls, exactly as Crow warriors had driven captured horses across the Great Plains for centuries. Behind him, German soldiers shouted in confusion. Shots were fired, but Joe was already disappearing into dawn mist, riding low on the horse's back, one with the animal. The herd thundering ahead, like his ancestors' herds had thundered before the reservations, before the cavalry, before everything changed. American soldiers watched in absolute astonishment as Joe Medicine Crow emerged from dawn fog riding a German cavalry horse, driving 50 more horses ahead of him, with the sounds of German shouting and ineffective rifle fire fading behind. When he reached American lines, when the chaos settled and the horses were secured, Joe dismounted. His face was split by a smile wider than anyone in his unit had ever seen. Captain Harrison approached, shaking his head in utter disbelief. "Medicine Crow, what in the name of God was that? Did you just steal 50 German horses? On horseback? In 1945? Joe's smile grew even wider. "Sir, I just became a war chief. The last war chief. 4th coup achieved." 3 weeks later, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Joe Medicine Crow had survived when so many hadn't. He'd earned the Bronze Star for bravery. He'd saved lives through his scouting. He'd served with honor. But none of that mattered as much as what he'd tell his grandfather. He'd achieved all 4 coups. He'd done what no man had accomplished in over 60 years. He'd kept the warrior tradition alive in the most unlikely circumstances imaginable. When Joe returned to the Crow Reservation in Montana in summer 1945, his grandfather was 92 years old, ancient and frail, his warrior body finally surrendering to time. But when Joe walked in wearing his uniform, the old man's eyes blazed with fierce joy. Joe sat beside him and told everything, every tale, leading the ammunition run through enemy territory, touching the German soldier, taking his weapon, showing mercy when he could have killed, stealing the horses with a Crow war cry that echoed through a German dawn. His grandfather listened without interruption. When Joe finished, the old warrior was silent for a long time, tears streaming down weathered cheeks, his hands trembling, not with age, but with emotion. "You did it," he whispered in Crow. "You kept us alive, the warrior tradition, our way, our people's honor. I thought it died with my generation, but you brought it forward. You're a war chief, grandson, the last war chief." The tribe held a ceremony, the elders confirming what Joe's deeds had proven. Joseph Medicine Crow was recognized as a war chief of the Crow Nation, the last man who would ever achieve that title. The specific circumstances that had allowed it, combat conditions that mixed ancient patterns with modern mechanized war, would never exist again. The age of the war chief had ended, but Joe had ensured it ended with honor, with achievement, with proof that the old ways still had power and meaning. But Joe didn't rest on warrior glory. He completed his doctorate, becoming Dr. Joseph Medicine Crow, the first Crow tribal member to earn that degree. He became a historian, author, lecturer, keeper of his people's stories. He wrote books about Crow culture, about Plains Indian history, about the warrior tradition that had shaped his life. He traveled the country, speaking at universities, museums, tribal gatherings, his voice carrying stories that needed to be heard, needed to be preserved, needed to be understood. He wanted people to know that Native cultures weren't museum exhibits, weren't primitive relics. They were living traditions, adapted and evolved, but still vital, still powerful, still relevant. In 2008, when Joe was 95 years old, something extraordinary happened. President Barack Obama awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor the United States can bestow. Joe attended the White House ceremony wearing a traditional Crow war shirt, beaded and beautiful, and an eagle feather in his hair, traditional marks of a war chief. Obama spoke about Joe's achievements, about his courage in World War II, about his lifetime dedication to preserving Crow culture. The audience, filled with dignitaries and veterans and tribal leaders, rose in a standing ovation that lasted minutes. Joe stood there, this elderly warrior who'd lived nearly a century, who'd seen his world transform completely, who'd fought in history's greatest war, who'd achieved the 4 coups and become the last war chief. And he wept openly, tears of pride and remembrance and gratitude that his grandfather's teachings had led him through everything. Joe Medicine Crow lived to be 102 years old, passing away on April the 3rd, 2016. His funeral was attended by thousands. Crow tribal members traveled from across Montana. Military veterans came from every state to honor one of their own. Historians, anthropologists, people whose lives he'd touched through his stories and teachings all gathered to say goodbye. They laid him to rest with full military honors and traditional Crow ceremonies woven together, a warrior's farewell that honored both worlds he'd navigated so successfully. Rifle volleys cracked across Montana's sky. Crow singers sang ancient songs. The flag that had draped his casket was folded with precision and handed to his family. And somewhere, perhaps, the spirit of an old warrior who died in the 1940s smiled, knowing his grandson had kept his promise, had remembered who he was, had brought honor to their people. The German soldier whose life Joe spared in that French alley, we'll never know his name or his fate. Did he make it home to Germany? Did he survive the war's final chaotic months? Did he tell his family about the American Indian soldier who could have killed him but didn't, who touched him instead with mercy that transcended warfare? Did he wonder, in the decades after, about that moment when death chose not to take him? Perhaps somewhere in Germany, an old man told his grandchildren about the day he faced an enemy who showed him that warriors could be compassionate, that courage included knowing when not to kill, that humanity could survive even in war's worst crucible. 2 warriors from opposite sides of the world connected forever by a touch in an alley, by a moment when ancient honor codes proved they still mattered, still had power, still could transform lives. Joe Medicine Crow's story resonates across time because it speaks to fundamental truths that transcend any single war or era. It tells us that cultural traditions have value beyond nostalgia, that they carry wisdom tested and refined across centuries. It shows us that ancient knowledge can inform modern challenges, that tracking skills passed down through generations can save lives in mechanized warfare, that old ways of moving through forests still work when satellites and radios fail. It demonstrates that you can be many things simultaneously, scholar and warrior, traditional and modern, Crow and American, that identities don't have to war with each other, but can strengthen each other instead. Most powerfully, Joe's story proves that mercy isn't weakness. When he touched that German soldier, instead of killing him, when he let an enemy live who'd cried for his mother, Joe showed greater courage than any amount of killing could demonstrate. True strength includes knowing when not to use force. True bravery includes compassion, even toward those who, moments before, were trying to kill you. Dr. Joseph Medicine Crow, war chief, historian, educator, Presidential Medal of Freedom recipient, lived for 102 years and never forgot who he was. He saw his world transform from the last days of warriors on horseback to the age of the internet and smartphones. He witnessed his people go from forced assimilation to cultural resurgence, from being forbidden to practice their traditions to proudly teaching them to new generations. Through all of it, he remained Crow. He honored his grandfather's teachings. He achieved the 4 coups on battlefields in Nazi Germany. He made certain that the warrior tradition would be remembered, would be understood, would inspire future generations. He was the last war chief, and he ensured that title meant something, that it would echo through time, that people would know what it meant to be Crow, to be brave, to be honorable, to be a warrior in the truest sense. His legacy lives on in every Native American who serves in the military, in every person who honors their cultural heritage while embracing their present, in every human who chooses mercy when they have the power to choose destruction. Joe Medicine Crow walked the warrior's path with honor, and in doing so, he lit a trail for all of us to follow.